Good morning, everyone. Shalom. My name is Rabbi Rivkin, Regional Director of Chabad. We founded the Chabad houses here in 1976, myself and then Rabbi Werdy. And now we have Rabbi Dabrowski, who we brought in 1983, and the others. We now have over 30 Chabad houses in Central Florida. The portion that we read yesterday on Shabbat at our center on Swan Avenue is known as Bahar and Bechukotai. The word Bahar means the mountain. What happened on a mountain? Those of you that are familiar with the biblical story in the 5 books of Moses, which are written in Hebrew, the word Bahar means a mountain. Why did God decide to give the 10 Commandments and the written law and the oral law on Mount Sinai to Moses? Our sages explain that is to indicate to us that we, carriers of the spiritual message that God wished to convey to all of humanity, chose the Jewish people to be the conveyors, ambassadors, and from there to their families, their tribes, their neighbors, and ultimately to all of the world. That there is a creator, God, who is the source of all existence, corporal and spiritual. So he gave it on a mountain, as our sages explained. This mountain was called Sinai. There's an interesting message in that word and name for this mountain. It's either in the deserts of Saudi Arabia or in the Sinai Peninsula. There is a mountain there that indicates that is where it occurred. The top of it is burnt, so to say. There is no fire, it seems, that came up from below. And as the biblical story recounts, the mountain, God came down upon the mountain in fire. So the purpose of the giving of the Torah to all of humanity is the guidebook for how we should live in the corporal, physical world, and infuse it with spirituality as well. So the word Sinai comes from the root Hebrew word Sinah, which means hatred. Why would a mountain where the Torah was given and the miracles that occurred be called Hatred Mountain? Root word. And the answer given is that being that the Bible and its teachings are there to underline to all of humanity that there is responsibility and there is goodness, and you need to fulfill the commandments that apply to whatever segments of the population, Jew and non-Jew alike. But people don't like that, and if you don't fulfill the responsibilities and the commandments, then you get punished. There are consequences. As we read in the last portion, which we read yesterday, known as Bechukotai, in my statutes you shall go. And if you keep them, then the rains will come in their time and everything will be good. But if not, then there's the fine print that says that things will not be good. And to the point where it's so, you could say, graphically depicted and described that no one is called up to that portion of the Torah. And the cantor just reads. And the purpose of all this is to underline to humanity, which is a corporal, physical entity, that you have responsibilities, and there are consequences, and there are rewards. If you do the good, and there are rewards. You do the opposite of good, there is negative consequences. And the Torah makes you become aware of it, enumerates it for you. So the world didn't like that. Who likes to be told that if you misbehave, you're going to be punished? And you see that there is a certain stubbornness against spirituality within the physical world. When God created the human being, He gave him an animal soul, him and her, and then a godly soul. And those two souls wrestle with each other. The godly soul seeks to find more spirituality and to live the life that the Torah, 5 books of Moses, teaches us. And the animal soul likes the physical stuff, which we all like, but have to be kept to a certain degree as Maimonides says, in moderation. Choose the middle path. Don't go to extremes. So those two portions emphasized by their names two important main requirements for us to ultimately be able to attain the spiritual utopia of the Messianic age. The first one, Bahar, the mountain, is where the Torah was given. And the second portion, which concludes the book of Leviticus, is known as Vayakhel. No, Bahar, Bechukotai. I'm sorry. That's a different one, Vayakhel. Bechukotai. You will walk and go in my statutes. Now we're in the period of the counting of the Omer, the 50 days from when the Jewish people left Egypt, Egyptian bondage, and then were given the Torah on the 50th day at Mount Sinai. So we count those days, one, as a form of preparation, focusing on the giving of the Torah to humanity, to the Jewish people, and through them to humanity. And at the same time also to, in a sense, purify ourselves from the mentality and environment of slavery that we were in for hundreds of years in Egypt. So they're a period of, you could say, of purification, that we should enable to go ahead and receive the Torah at Mount Sinai. So the word Bechukotai means my statutes. Now in Judaism, there are 3 adjectives for the commandments. There are the adjectives known as chukah, which means the decree. Chukah chakakti, I engraved the decree. Gezerah gezarti, I decreed it. Ve'en lach reshus lahar he'acharam, you can't think about it and question it, because it's beyond you. You can't understand. The commandments given to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai were the chukim. Then there were the mishpatim, the civil laws found in the Torah that have logic behind them, understanding behind them. And then there are the edut. Edut is the Hebrew word aid, which means a witness. So edut represents the concept of a commemoration. For instance, the holiday of Passover is one of the commandments that is associated with edut, commemorating the anniversary of our exodus from Egypt. An anniversary, wedding anniversary, a variety of things that people commemorate, birthday, because it's a good thing that happened to them. So the eduts are in a sense witnesses to an occurrence that occurred. And that also has a logic to it. Well, we got married, we're released from Egyptian bondage. A variety of logics can be associated with the mitzvot of the Eidut, the witnessing commandments. But all of them should ultimately be kept on the level because God commanded us, not because I understand, and therefore I agree with you, God. You give a stamp of approval. No. You do your commandments and fulfill them because God commanded. That is a much higher level, you could say, of serving God, serving Hashem. If we as Jews and all humanity serve God because God commanded us, that's a very high level. So we have these two names to these two portions. We read a double portion during leap years, certain of the Sabbaths, and that was this past Saturday. And the portion was Bahar and Behukotah. When the Jewish people received the Torah at Mount Sinai, it says that they were Ke'ish Echad Belev Echad. They were like one person, one man, with one heart, even though they were millions that had come and left Egypt. We know there were 600,000 males from age 20 to 60. Then you can count the women and the children and all the others. You're looking at a nation of a few million people. So the key ingredient needed that the Torah indicates to us in using the singular rather than the many, should have said, like many hearts, many people. Why? Like one person, one heart. Because the requirement was unity. The ability to go ahead and be a united people is what ultimately brings about positive and good things and rewards. When there is unity, there is blessing. We know that one of the names of God is Shalom. The whole concept of peace, of wholeness. So therefore, that was a need to receive the Torah. The Torah also is called the Torah of peace, and its teachings bring peace to the world. So we are now in the midst of the 49 days of the counting of the Omer from Passover, which was 5 weeks ago, culminating with the 2 more weeks that we have to go to the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. And our sages say that that occurrence was something that wasn't just for the Jewish people, even though they were chosen to be the conveyors and the ambassadors of spirituality to humanity, as we see. But it was for all peoples. So the holiday of Shavuot, which is coming up in 2 weeks, known in English as Pentecost, the word Penta means 5. Why is it called? It's when the 5 books of Moses were given to humanity, and that's why it's 5, Penta. Occurs on the 26th of May, and on the 27th of May is the holiday of Shavuot, which can also mean oaths, weeks, a time frame. The main thing is that we receive the Torah and we study it and we practice it, each one at his or her own level, in one way or another, is able to fulfill the commandments that apply to them. And there are 613 commandments, many of which do not apply to everyone. They apply to a king, they apply to if you're a farmer, etc. So don't get worried that how can I do 613 commandments? You don't need to do that many. You start with 1 or 2 and go from there. Study them. So where should I study them, Rabbi? I live in Timbuktu. God provided an answer. Now we have the internet, And you can go online, and you can go ahead to Chabad.org, CHABAD.org, and you can learn Torah at your convenience and your time restraints. So the mountain brought responsibility down to earth. And why was it then given on a mountain? Why couldn't it have been given in a field? So it says that God wanted us to be visible. You're going to be the nation that will exist throughout history and throughout time. Because that's your job, to convey the Torah. So we see that the Jewish people, regardless of the fact that they are a small minority, still exist. And regardless of all the persecutions and all of the attempts at annihilating us, they always fail. That's history. And that's because we have the promise and the protection of God that being that your mission is the whole reason for why I created the universe, which is that you should be the conveyors of spirituality to the world. So therefore you got to remain around. And therefore I will protect you. And history has shown that to be the case. So as long as the Jewish people fulfill their mission of being a light onto the nations of the world, and being the role models on how it is that you're supposed to keep the Torah and its commandments, so then the portion tells us that what will be, and I'll quote here, Im bechukotai telechu, if you will pursue and keep my laws and my mitzvot, commandments, in other words, my decrees, the chukim, and the mitzvot, which are composed of mishpatim, as I explained before, and composed of edut, in other words, logical commandments and witnessing commandments, tishmeru, you will keep them. It's not just that you'll keep them on the shelf. The Torah tells us God knows the tricks of humanity, of the Yetzer Hara, and he says, to end that sentence, V'asisem osam, and you will do them. It's not enough that you will learn about them. It's not enough that you will think about them, but you have to do them. Then the Torah says you will be rewarded. And the Satik Yishmechem Be'itam, the rains will come in their time, and the earth will give forth its produce, and the trees of the field will give their fruit. Everything will be peaches and maybe cream. But in any event, it is a concept of reward and punishment. If you misbehave, and you do things that are destructive, and you go to war, and you kill, and you covet, and all the things that are enumerated in the Ten Commandments, and you're immoral, then there will be consequences. We live, unfortunately, in a time when the world is not at peace. It is, unfortunately, in a substantial amount of war and distress. So we must always ask ourselves, when will we ultimately attain the utopian age of the Messianic age? When there will be Mashiach. Maimonides, and I want to go back to some of this to tie it into a few things that we are learning about now. In conclusion of the book of Leviticus, as it's known, Vayikra, the word Vayikra means God calls out. Well, who does God call to? He calls to Moses. But Moses is the conveyor of the teachings of the third book of the 5 books of Moses, is the book of the offerings, the sacrifices, the rituals that were in the tabernacle and then later on in the temple. Now that the temple is destroyed, the tabernacle is not around, so we have none of these commandments that we can fulfill that were associated with the book of Vayikra. The word Vayikra, when you look at it in the scroll of the 5 books of Moses, the first word, which means to call out, at the end there is an Aleph. The Aleph is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And that Aleph is small compared to the regular letters there. And our sages explain that the reason why it is written this way is to indicate to us humans that in order to attain the knowledge of God, of the Torah, we need to be humble, open to the fact that we are, after all, corporal beings, and therefore to accept God's teachings and open our minds and our hearts, and above all, realizing that we are, after all, very finite, and God, the Creator, who has imbued the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, with His knowledge, which is something that is tailored for the finite human being, because God doesn't have any restrictions or any adjectives that you can really describe Him by. God is neither he nor her. He is what He is, it says. So that we can relate to what God is expressing in the Torah, there are adjectives used that we can understand and relate to. When it says God's strong right arm, doesn't mean that God has a huge 50-foot arm. It means that strength is in the right. So therefore it's called the right arm by most people. The right hand is the strongest. And so the Torah speaks to us in the vernacular and in the adjectives that we humans can relate to and understand. And so at the conclusion of the book of Leviticus, we come to the point of Chazak, Chazak, v'nis chazek. Be strong, and you will be strengthened. Strong in the ways of the learning of the Torah and the mitzvahs, and you will be strong. You will remain a people. So coming back to this period of the counting of the Omer, and we just had a week ago that special day called Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of the Omer. That was the day when Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the great sage who composed the Zohar, passed on from this world. He didn't die, he passed on. None of us really dies. We go on to another dimension, the soul does. The bodies return to the earth. So, being that he was one of the great students of Rabbi Akiva, who was one of the greatest sages of all time, and he had many, many students, Rabbi Akiva did. He had 24,000 students. But because they maybe lacked that respectfulness one to the other, you ever notice sometimes professors sort of look down at other professors. They know more. They're smarter. And who are you, so to say? They treated each other disrespectfully, divisively. They were divided. And therefore, there was a punishment that was elicited upon them, and they started to die in a pandemic because of that lack of unity. And especially since Rabbi Akiva taught the concept of V'ahavta l'reacha kamecha, you shall love your fellow as yourself. This brought about a decree from heavens that they would die. And so this is also known, the Omer period, as a period of mourning, that we mourn the tragedy that occurred, and there's a certain diminishment in this 47-day period, last 3 days before the holiday of Shavuot, our happy days, but of diminishment of joy. Those that follow and are aware of the laws, they don't get married during this period, there's no music, it's diminished, except on the day, the 33rd day of the Omer, when Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai passed away, and because of his greatness, the plague stopped. But we see that what was the cause of that plague? It was the cause that there was a lack of unity, a lack of brotherly love amongst the students, a lack of shalom, of peace and wholeness, and therefore it brought on a plague. I've always wondered, since the destruction of the temple, the second temple, our sages said the offerings aren't possible anymore, the sacrifices aren't possible, the incense offerings are not possible. So therefore, they instituted that the prayers and enunciating of the paragraphs of what those offerings stood for are instead of the offerings. It's also brought down that God has great pleasure, so to say, from the offerings, from the incense. So the question immediately that one can ask is, hey, God has everything. What's this that he likes to the smell of the incense? What does it really mean? Or like he says, my food, the offerings, which were burnt on the altar. God is not physical. God doesn't need food. He has anything and everything he wants. So what is it that this seems to indicate? And I found it, very puzzling in a sense, just in the simple meaning of the words. And I'll read them to you. There were 11 incenses incorporated in the incense offering. And what were they? The rabbis taught, how is the incense mixture formulated? And it goes to and enumerates, there were 368 measurements of this. And all of this was put together and then offered on the altar. 11 kinds of spices were in it, and they enumerate them as follows. Stacte, S-T-A-C-T-E, or stacte. Oncha, O-N-Y-C-H-A. You can look it up in the Webster's Dictionary. Galbanum, frankincense, with particular amounts, which are all enumerated at Mount Sinai. The myrrh, the cassia was number 6. The spikenard was number 7. Saffron was 8. Then there was number 9, the costus. And then there was number 10, the aromatic bark. And then the cinnamon. There was also additional karshina, lye, and then there was cypress wine. So when you think about all these spices, about whatever combinations they were, you should know that some of them are not very pleasant spices. So what does that mean, that God found them pleasant? So it's explained as follows, I think. When there is unity, when there is a togetherness, then God is pleased. When he sees his children, and he sees them all united, working together, that is what is pleasing to God. Because individually, some of these spices are not very pleasant. The fact that they underline the concept of unity, that is what was pleasing and pleasant to Hashem, to God. And that, of course, brings us back to this idea of the unity of the Jewish people, for that matter, that all people should have. That if children in a family are fighting each other, what do the parents usually do? They run out of the house. I can't take this anymore. But if they're together, working together, sharing together, united, the parents say, we'll stay with you. Divided, you want to be divided? I'm not going to be here. And so the Shekhinah, which is, you could say, the presence of God, departs. It's interesting to note that the word Shekhinah means to rest upon, shochen, the root word. It also means shchuna, a neighborhood. If you're neighborly, then God's there. If you're fighting each other, the Shekhinah departs. And unfortunately, tragedies come. So we saw that happen in the days of the Yomer. And therefore we must always remember that it is incumbent upon us to be united, to work together. And if we do, according to the plans of the Torah, the Bahar, the mountain of Sinai, then there is the Bechukotai Telecho, by going in the ways, and there is reward, and there is also a concept of corrective punishments. One isn't given a punishment because you want to torture the person. You want to correct him or her from what? From doing it again. Why do colleges and universities and schools give you tests? To torture you? No. They want you to sit and study all night, so to say, so that you don't have to experience the consequences of failure. And therefore, it's for your betterment. It's not just to punish the person, so to say. So this is the message of God's revelation to the Jewish people and to all of the world at Mount Sinai on the holiday of Shavuot. So they had this revelation come to them, and for them to be able to go ahead and experience it, it was because they were united. If we want to have a world of peace and harmony, we have to unite. We have to accept upon ourselves, so to say, the responsibilities or the yoke of heaven that God gave to humanity in the form of the Torah and the Ten Commandments. To be kind, united, caring, sharing humanity, a peaceful humanity. So there is a promise that the world will eventually, according to the Talmud and in a variety of sources, experience that time and period known as the Messianic Age. And it's called, and Maimonides enumerates them, Ani Mamin Be'emunah Shlema, I believe, was a complete faith. What? In the coming of Mashiach, the anointed one, who will be a descendant of the house of David,
And Maimonides writes, V'afa pi she'ishma mea, even though he tarries. Jacob wanted to tell his children when they were in Egypt when the Messianic age would come. And the Heavenly Spirit left him because it would be so far into the future. So he didn't remember, he couldn't tell. In Kolzeh, even so, Ahakale, I wait, I anticipate every day that he will come. It's one of the 13 principles of faith of the Jewish people. And the whole concept of the rising of the dead then follows principle number 13, which isn't so far-fetched anymore. If you think about cloning, hey, it seems it's possible. So, 50 or 100 years ago, you couldn't even imagine the concept of the rising of the dead. Yes, there is the prophecy of Ezekiel and the valley of bones, the dry bones, etc. But that was a prophecy. We're still now in the 21st century. When's it going to happen? So the Torah tells us when it will happen. It will happen when you will go ahead and fulfill my commandments. Now the Torah is really you could say, the algorithm for the course of human history. And everything that occurs in it, that will occur even into the future of human history, is encoded there. Because it's the knowledge of God, so to say. So it's not finite, it's infinite. But in order to be able to comprehend it and understand it, we need to be able to go ahead and learn it. So God said to the assembled Jews at the foot of Mount Sinai, I have this treasure in my treasure house. I'd like to give it to you. It's called the Torah. So the Jews said, okay, what's written in it? God told them. They said, okay, we'll take 2. So they got 2 tablets. The 10 Commandments are in the form of 2 tablets. But they accepted upon themselves the Mishnah by saying the words Nasa, we will do, then Nishma, and then we will listen. Usually it's the other way around. Usually I'll listen to what you're saying, and then I'll do it. They said, no, we trust it completely. We will do it, no matter what. This whole level of accepting God's teaching, this is the way it is. We take it, then we'll understand it. Is Nasa v'Nishma, which showed a certain degree of total, you could say, allegiance to God, beyond our logic. But God wasn't sure that they would keep it. So he said, well, I'm going to give you this treasure, but give me a guarantee that you'll keep it. Well, he said, well, the sages will study it, and the patriarchs will be the ones to take care of it. God said, no. So finally they said, our children, we will teach it to our children. And that God accepted as the guarantors. Because if you teach it to your children, there is a tomorrow. If you don't, that's why it's so crucial that we, as the people of the book, should study the Torah, teach it to our children, not just with words, but with actions, as it says in the portion that we just read. So, the laws of the Torah are infinite, encoded within finite words, chapters, and stories, for us humans to be able to relate to. So, any questions? No questions. That's good. Being that there was a period in time, unfortunately for many, many millenniums,
that the Jews had to go through periods of persecution. They were not allowed to study the Torah. And they were not allowed to teach it to their children. At a period in time, it was the Syrian Greeks. So, in order not to forget it, so that the sages instituted that the Jewish people should read a portion of the prophets that is similar to the message of the 5 books of Moses, which the dictators who ruled over the Jews did not want that they should study it. It was more of a religious tract. They said it's okay, historical tracts are okay for you to study or read. That's the Greek mentality. But as far as your religion, no, you cannot go ahead and practice it or read it or learn it. So the portion that was chosen for the Torah reading of the Hukotai comes from Jeremiah. Jeremiah was the prophet at the time when the Jewish people were sent into exile with the destruction of the Second Temple. And so there has to be a similarity between the prophetic portion that we read, known as the Eis Aliyah, the Haftarah, and the 7 preceding portions of segments that you would read in the Torah. So the one chosen for this particular week, when we conclude the book of Leviticus, and we're in a sense in a time of mourning, because it's in the period when there was the pandemic that decimated the 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva. So Jeremiah starts out as follows. He's speaking to God. And he says as follows. God, you are my power and my strength, my source of wonder and my refuge on the day of trouble. The non-Jewish nations will eventually come to you from the very ends of the earth and admit and say, our fathers, by teaching us to be idolaters, have handed down only lies to us and useless emptiness. The nations of the world with their various religions, etc., have taught us wrongly. And unfortunately, we the Jews have been affected by them. And he continues and he says, Hayasa le'adam elakim. Is it possible that a person can make gods for himself? Idols, totem poles, whatever you want to call them. When those that make them are not gods. If you're not God, you can't make a god, right? You don't have the power. If you're God, then maybe you can make a god, but why do you need to make a god? Because you're God. So he says this, the prophet Jeremiah. So therefore, God replies to him, therefore behold, how I will let them know the error of their ways. This time, I will let them know the extent of my power and my might. They will thereby know that my name is Hashem, God, the 4-letter name of. And as the Creator, I am powerful enough to fulfill my promises. In other words, I have the power. But I've, in a sense, hidden myself, concealed myself, so that you can have true freedom of choice, you humans. I've entrusted you to be my partner, so to say. Where do we see that? In the beginning of the book of Genesis. The Torah tells us when God created Adam and Eve, he says, I created you, la'avdo, to take care of it, to work it, ulashamro, and to take care of it. The world, the universe, the corporal state of existence. And God commanded them. Then when they ate from the tree of knowledge, so they were banished from the Garden of Eden. And the consequences were what? Anyone know? No?
What were consequences?
The consequences were for Eve that she would give birth in pain, and Adam would rule over her. And Adam, you're going to go ahead and have to till the soil, toil, sweat it, and only then will you be able to have food to eat. No more freebies. Unless the two of you decide to go ahead and eat from the tree of life, eternal life, I'm banishing you. Why didn't God want them to live eternally, so to say? The answer is because then there would have been an eternal imperfection in the creation. So the existence of humanity can only be up to the point 6,000, the sixth millennium. If you count from the creation of Adam and Eve, we are now in the year 5783 from the creation of the universe, of Adam and Eve. So if you do your math, 5,783, deduct that from 6,000, how many more years we have to go? Maximum, before the Messianic age, if we don't blow ourselves up sooner, unfortunately, tragically. So the reality is that the purpose of the concept of the 6,000 years is really in order to have created a venue of freedom of choice for humanity to choose the godly path or the evil path. God created good and evil. You can't have choice if you don't have the two sides of the coin. You have to have two sides of the coin. So God created, call it the satanic angel, to give the evil side of the coin that people can choose, and the godly soul, the godly angel, the Yetzer Tov, to help choose the right path. The animal soul has more to do with the body. We know that the body is an enticing type of entity, which we have to, in one way or another, refine and harness to service the godly. So in this Haftorah of the Chukotai, it goes further. But remember, the prophets are also foretelling the future. And as I said before, the Torah has within it the course of all of history, encoded. That if you have the right tools, you will be able to, there are 70 levels to the 600,000 letters and combinations. If you do your math, it's like an infinite amount almost. And he goes on and continues and he says, the sinfulness of the kingdom of Judah has become so habitual, and therefore there will be a punishment. And he continues and he says, you residents of Jerusalem who dwell upon the mountain, situated in the midst of fields, I will give your wealth and all your treasures to your enemies as spoil. Your sacrificial platforms were constructed in sin because they had become idol worshippers for the purpose of idolatry. They are everywhere within the borders of your land. And so by going into exile, you will perforce give your land
the release it should have received in the sabbatical and jubilee years that you did not observe. In the Bible it says, and we read it this past week, you should give the land a 7th year of rest and the 50th year of the jubilee. And if you do not keep my statutes, so on account of your land that I gave you, an account, and you abused it, I will make you serve your enemies in the lands that you did not know, for you have, so to speak, kindled a fire of anger. And then Jeremiah stops. He says as follows, K'yamar Hashem, so does God say. Cursed is the person who, instead of trusting my promise to provide for you during the sabbatical years and during the times of need, trusts in the strength of humans, of human effort, and makes the power of mortal flesh his trusted arm, and whose heart turns away from God. And here you see something very interesting. When you trust in humans, you can't always rely that what they said or promised they will do it. And we sit at a time in Jewish history when Israel is faced with that kind of a question. The headlines of the world today tell us about, those that are familiar with the history of what's been going on. There's a war in Ukraine. Supposedly, it was guaranteed that if Ukraine would give up her nuclear weapons when the Soviet Union fell apart, then Russia and America and Germany and England would all guarantee that she would be safe. Well, it doesn't look like that worked out too well. And if there is any help being given to Ukraine, it's because otherwise you'll have all of Eastern Europe fall under the sway of the Russians, as Putin said he wants to do. So you can't really trust that Minsk Accord that was signed in the 1990s. Then came along Afghanistan. We guaranteed that we will be there to do what we have to do to help. Well, we fled, right? And then we have always these promises to Israel that we will have your back. And we will make sure that Iran will not get nuclear weapons, right? It's ironclad. I dare say that one should take that with a grain of salt. Because when the time comes, it might not be the way you said it would be. So Israel is faced today. Israel is the chosen people in the chosen land by God, was standing alone. Even though this one says, oh, we've got your back, and this one says this. But when push comes to shove, one must wonder if you will be there to help. And that's what Jeremiah is saying. Or HaGever, cursed is the person Asher Yiftach B'Adam, that trusts in Adam, in a man, Adam. The Psalm Basar Zrayai Min Hashem Yasur Libayim. From God, he turns away. He says, nah, we don't need God. Who says it? Who says there's a God? We're atheists, etc., etc. I don't have to enumerate who are the ones that are saying it, and what can, God forbid, be the consequences. We must always remember that God is ultimately the one who fulfills what he says he will do. And every instant of the day, you could say, God recreates the universe, gives it energy to exist and remain. As King David says in his Psalms, La'elam dvarcha nitzav bashamayim. Forever are your words embedded in the heavens. Which words? So we read the story of Genesis that God said, let there be the stars, let there be the moon, let there be. With speech, God went ahead and created the universe. So we as human beings must learn from what the Torah teaches us. And it teaches us that we should fulfill the commandments, do the commandments. They will benefit us and better us spiritually, but as well physically. Some of the main commandments that we are able to fulfill even today are the laws of kashrut, of kosher. What does that mean? Why should I keep kosher? Well, science, as we advance in our knowledge of science, is becoming more and more aware of the fact that our health and well-being is dependent on what we eat and how we eat. Our ancestors firmly believed in their religious way of living and considered the observance of the commandments to be justified and beneficial for us. But today, we live in a time when there is a lack of Jewish education and Jewish belief, especially after the Holocaust. Today's Jews lack the strength of their ancestors, faith and conviction, and therefore they pose questions. And they examine the biblical laws in the light of contemporary science, medicine, knowledge, financial considerations, and above all, the standpoint of practicality, so to say, and convenience. Why can't I have my cheeseburger? Torah says you shouldn't eat meat and milk together, cook it, etc. So the fact is that the laws that were given thousands of years ago to us humans, at that point we had no way of understanding anything about them. We were like, we were still running around with our horse and wagon, so to say. So what does the word kosher mean? And it's explained that it's, in a sense, preventive medicine. Medical authorities have come to recognize beyond doubt that the laws of kashrut are fundamentally health laws. Statistics have shown that observant Jews who keep the commandments are immune from and less susceptible to certain types of diseases, and that their lifespan is frequently longer than that of their neighbors. In the Middle Ages, when epidemics ravaged many a country, the Jews seemed to hardly be affected by them at all. There was a certain immunity there, to the point where it gave rise to hideous accusations against the Jews that they had caused the plagues by poisoning the wells. And since they didn't poison their wells, so therefore they weren't being affected. How else could a primitive, ignorant people explain to themselves the fact that the Jew stayed healthy while others around were dying? Although much remains to be discovered to explain in every detail the food laws in kashrut, enough is already known to warrant the assumption that their observance is beneficial to the human body. Some of you may have heard of the Mediterranean diet, this diet, that diet. The reality is that if the Creator created all, He obviously would want to protect his masterpiece, his painting, by safeguarding it. So he would give it instructions how to safeguard it. So the commandments are those instructions on how to keep yourself well and healthy, because that will then allow you to continue to be a servant of God. No observant Jews have ever been afflicted with dreadful diseases like trichinosis, which comes from eating pork, or a certain type of hepatitis from eating oysters, which afflicts annually millions of people around the world. And through the dietary laws, it seems the Jews have been protected from these sicknesses, tularemia, that comes from eating rabbit. The hareps, I think it's called, which are the most popular meats among the peoples of Asia and Africa. So the reality is that when God gave the Jewish people the commandments, and I know many people that also follow the so-called kosher laws, and the fact that you should remove the hard fat from your diet, and you should not eat the blood of the animal that you have prepared to eat. In fact, recently Dr. Paul W. White, one of the famous American doctors, said, "Give careful heed to the biblical command of every manner of fat that you shall not eat it." It's removed. The heavy fats. They're not healthy for you. 800 years ago, the famous doctor and philosopher and codifier of Jewish law, Maimonides, spoke the language of modern medicine, saying, "As for fat of the inwards, it is forbidden, because it coarsens and destroys the abdomen, creating cold, clamming blood in our vessels." So that wrote that about 900 years ago. We don't understand these laws, really. They're in a sense laws that are a decree. But we can see the correlation that these are not carnivorous animals or scavenger animals. They are herbivorous. They're domesticated grass, etc. That obviously creates a certain environment in our bodies. They did a study at the University of Minnesota. I think I once mentioned it before. They trained worms to traverse a maze. And then they took those worms, chopped them up, and fed them to other worms. And then they used that group of worms that were fed the trained worms to compare them to other worms that were not trained and see which ones traversed the maze most proficiently. And lo and behold, they discovered that the worms that were given, the trained worms to eat, traversed the maze, I think, 20% easier. It's a study done. What does that indicate? It indicates that we are affected by what we eat. That's a study at the University of Minnesota. All of the commandments of the Torah benefit the creatures they were given to. It's common sense. If you create a painting, a beautiful painting, you're not going to go and create an environment that'll destroy it, that'll harm it. You spend so much time, so much energy, and so much effort to make A beautiful painting, you're not going to harm it. You'll want to protect it. So the commandments of the Torah are there for our benefit. And even though we may not see them, even comprehend them, that's because we don't have the tools yet to understand the higher levels of it. I mean, there is a deep message here to all of us, that there is a higher level of consciousness, of godliness than the physical corporal world. And it directs and gives us freedom of choice to choose the good or the opposite. Any questions? All this is incorporated in the laws of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and the prophets, known as the Tanakh. T sound is for Torah, N sound is for the Nevi'im, the prophets, and then there are the Ketuvim, the writings of the Psalms, the Song of Songs, and ultimately the Talmud, which incorporates within it the oral law. All this is the treasure given at Mount Sinai, which we will shortly celebrate in 2 weeks, on the 26th and the 27th of May, which are the 5th and the 6th day, the 6th and the 7th day of the month of Sivan. So, questions? No questions. So here is a book called Letters of Fire. It's a Kabbalistic book, mystical insights into the Hebrew language. Let me give you an example very briefly. Aleph is 1. That's the first letter. Beit is the second letter, if you're studying Hebrew. But the word Beit is also the letter that spells Bayit, house. Beis, Yud, Taf is Bayit. Bayit, Beis, or in Sephardic Hebrew, Beit, which means that it's a house. When you have 2 letters, you can now build a house already. And a variety, you could say, of things are built with the letters. So God chose the utterances of the letters in the speech that He created the universe with. And those combinations have messages and teachings for us to be able to go ahead and navigate the world through. I'll give you an example. The Hebrew word tzaka, sukkah, right? Difficulty, leads to the word, it has the letters of haketz, which means the end. The end of what? The end of days. In the portion of Vayechi, when Jacob passes away in the end of Genesis, the word is used, kates. He wanted to give them the kates, the end of days. But God didn't want. So He stopped it. Then there is, for instance, the word tzara, which is trouble, right? If you're familiar at all. Tzara means trouble. So what does the trouble cause? When you have trouble, you running across the street and you trip. Now you have pain in your neck, and you twisted your ankle, etc. So you stop and you think to yourself and you say, "Hey, this is terrible. I have this sorrow that just happened." You can take the word nirtza, which has in it the letters of tzara, and it gives you the word find favor. Nirtza. In the Haggadah we have Hallel Nirtza. you'll find a way how to not trip anymore. You'll say, oh, I was running, so I shouldn't be running. So you'll find a way how not to experience the pain. But tzara does help you become a little bit more careful, right? This is all the combinations and permutations of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, which are the letters which become the conduits for the various energies that inhabit and sustain the person, the item, whatever it is. And so it's not just a happenstance. These are conduits. When a person is, God forbid, ill and in danger of, God forbid, dying, a severe illness, you add a name of life, like Chaya, Chayim, which means life. It gives that person at the Torah conduits of additional life to sustain him or her in their time of illness. So there are many, many words like that. In fact, all of the letters of the Torah, there's a book that came out a while ago called The Codes that are found in the Torah. There are at least 2 or 3 of those books, equidistant codes, that with the computers of today we can get knowledge of things that happened later on in time. Because the Torah is the blueprints for all of creation. So to everyone, a happy and healthy summer, because Shavuos usually comes along with the summer travel period, and above all, the giving of the Torah that helps civilize humanity. All the religions have one form or another of the Torah incorporated in them. That's because ultimately we must all, when the Messianic age will start again, and we will turn our spears and our swords into pruning hooks and into plows to feed the world rather than destroy the world, then we will merit to be in the Messianic age. That's a forecast for the future. Hopefully it's not that far off. Because we're doing very well at destroying the earth, creating war. But there is also a concept of truth, emes. The Hebrew word emet is composed of 3 letters. Aleph, which is 1. There is only one. That's God, the creator of all. Then you have Mem, which is the Hebrew letter for wisdom and understanding. Then there is the last letter, which is the Taf, which stands for Torah. Everything is beholden to the Aleph and comes from the Aleph, which is one God. You humans can go ahead and work at understanding the Torah. That's the Mem. And it says, up to when a person attains 40, he will attain levels of understanding of his teacher. Mem, 40. And then there's the Taf of Torah. If you put the 3 letters together, you get the word truth. If you take away the Aleph, you get the word met, dead. That's what it is. The Hebrew word for death is a met. Mem, Taf. So all this is incorporated in 3 letters. And that's the way it is. Let us give us another example, a word. Shema which means here, Yisrael, Israel. My Yisrael. Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, God is one. The word Shema has in it the abbreviation Su'u Marom Einechem. Raise up your eyes to the heights. Word Marom means heights. What do you see when you raise your eyes up to the heights? See the heavens. So remember, Yisrael, Israel. The name of Jacob, when he wrestled with the angel of Esau, became Israel. The word Israel spells out two other words, the combinations. It has in it the name of God, the Aleph and the Lamed, but it also has the word in it, Li Rosh. Li means to me, Rosh, you are the head. I gave you the Torah, and you are the head that has to convey it to the rest of the body, so to say, to all of humanity. Li Rosh. All that is encapsulated in those Yud, Shin, Reish, Aleph, Lamed, 5 letters. And that is true on a myriad of levels. That the letters of the Torah give us teachings in the various combinations. So we should receive the Torah in a peaceful and harmonious and united way and realize that it is the knowledge of God, and accept it, study it, and do it. The famous sentence of Kikare v'lecha adavar me'ed. It is very, very close to you, the words of the Torah. Beficha, in your mouth, la'asei, to do it. Beficha, in your mouth, bilvavcha, in your heart, la'asei, to do it. Those are the ways you bring it out into action. There's the machshava, the thought. There is the speech, the talk, dibur. But then there is the maaseh, the action. Those are the garments of the soul through which we express ourselves and affect the world and the universe. So shalom to everyone. Look forward to speaking to you next week. And I hope you enjoy the classes.